Folks, are you ready to reduce your feed costs? Who isn't? Hey, I'm Shay Warner and I host the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Today we are going to be visiting with Carson Roberts about why some ranchers, maybe a lot of ranchers, should stop producing hay and look at alternative options for feeding cattle. Whether that's buying hay, more days spent grazing. We cover a lot of ground in this podcast, and we cover everything from what goes into finding the true cost of production for hay so you can determine if it's a profitable enterprise for you or not, as well as some of those alternatives like we just mentioned, from buying hay and what to consider when you do that, as well as how to incorporate more days spent grazing, etc. It's a really valuable conversation. There's so much to offer in it, so sit back, enjoy your coffee, and enjoy the conversation. Hey folks, just a quick note here. If you're raising cattle, you've likely heard the phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. Weights are critical, from tracking rates of gain to knowing when to sell to making sure treatments are dosed correctly. That's where the right scale setup makes all the difference. The team at cattlescales.com can help you find the right True Test scale system so you can easily capture accurate weights. True Test scales are rugged and dependable, made specifically for livestock. The team at cattlescales.com is made up of ranchers who use the same weigh scales in their own herds. Find your scale setup at cattlescales.com. All right, Carson, thank you for joining me today, and I'm excited to visit with you on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I have listened to quite a few of your episodes, so you have some awesome guests. So hopefully I can contribute something in my own little way, but we'll see.
Well, I think it's going to be a great conversation, and we're going to be talking about haying, specifically the cost of production and some other alternative feed options that cattle producers should maybe consider to help their bottom line. Before we dive into that, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what your background is?
That would be great. And I think that a lot of my background maybe helped me arrive at the conclusions that I have, or biases, whatever you want to call it, my bias about haying, I guess you could say. So I grew up in a little valley, Cache Valley, Idaho. It's right on the Utah border. Grew up on an alfalfa and barley farm there. So we produced small square bales of alfalfa. I made a lot of hay and I threw a lot of bales during that time. So it was kind of a fun time. We sold to the horse hay market in the Salt Lake City area. So oftentimes we were stacking hay on trucks and delivering it to horse farms. But, a lot of great experiences. I have to say about all of that I really enjoy making hay. I really enjoy the work that goes into it. Spend a lot of time messing around with irrigation. If you're from that part of the world, then you'll know what I'm talking about when I talk about hand lines and wheel lines. We didn't have any pivots, I guess. Those were for nice square fields, and we didn't have any of those. So anyway, that's how I grew up. My dad also had a small cow-calf operation, but that was kind of a nights and weekends ordeal. And there again, with the cattle operation, it was just a lot of the hay that the horse people didn't really want, and that's what the cows got, which it was kind of a nice compliment to the enterprise, because when you're dealing with horse hay customers, there's quite a few horse people are pretty picky. So that was my childhood all the way through college. Milked a lot of cows during college, and later on in my teenage years, milked a lot of cows to pay for college. And then I kind of dived off into the world, I guess, as it were. Went to South Dakota and worked with alfalfa growers in South Dakota for a while. I went to Alaska, worked at a fishing lodge in Alaska. And then I ended up deciding to go the graduate school route, and I went to Utah State and researched alfalfa and hay production there. And then I went to Mississippi State for a PhD, all of this, all of that stuff in agronomy, the agronomy side of things. And I did a lot of research in conservation cropping systems in cotton, of all things. One thing I realized being a soil scientist and a plant scientist, pretty much all crops are the same. And so if you figure out how to grow one, you can kind of figure out how to grow them all. It doesn't take too much. Like my brother, he always teases his farmer neighbors because he says it really doesn't take a whole lot of intelligence to put a seed in the ground and make it grow, and it takes a real man to make a profitable business. So that's where we are today. That's what we're trying to accomplish is profitability, not just putting the seed in the ground and making it grow. So after completing my PhD, I got a job in Linneus, Missouri, working for the University of Missouri as a state forage specialist. Forages are kind of my thing. I really enjoy working with forages, everything involved there. So the research center that I'm at is a working cattle operation. They have about 350 the university has about 350 head of cattle that they run here. And I do all of the research on growing forages here at the research center. And it's been pretty fun. I also have a small herd of cattle myself here in Missouri. So that's been a fun experience, trying to grow cattle in a different part of the country than where I was raised and trying to figure all that out, different forage species, all that. So it's been fun.
So from your perspective, from your personal experience and in your career, why is it so important that ranchers know the cost of production when it comes to hay?
Well, I guess the question you got to go back to is, are you running a business or is this a hobby that you're having fun with? If this is a hobby and you're just having fun, then you know what? You can get by just knowing that you're doing okay. If you're running a business, run a business. Treat it like a business and do business-like things. One of those things is accounting and cost management. So that's to begin with. If you're going to run a business, run a legit business where you know your costs. You know your cost of production, as what they say in the business world, the cost of goods sold. What type of costs you're incurring, whether they're overhead costs or fixed costs or variable costs. The more you understand all of that, the better you are able to manipulate those numbers for your benefit. I think that's the important part. It's all just about getting above the business and looking down at it. And numbers are a really good way to do that. Your numbers, not someone else's numbers. Look at your numbers. And then you can do things strategically to position yourself to hopefully make a good profit. So that's the goal, right? To make a good profit.
Yes. So how can producers determine a true cost of production for their hay to make sure that they're not leaving anything out that could be skewing those numbers?
Yeah, when we're talking about haying systems in particular, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And you need to bring all of that into one place. Usually where I start, because I'm a university guy, I'm going to look at the University of Missouri hay and forage budget sheets. Anywhere you are in the nation, you usually have access to a hay and forage budget for your region. So here I just pulled one up. And I'll just go down through some of the line items of things that you ought to consider in your haying enterprise. And so top line, you're going to first look at your income. Of course, if you're running a haying operation, you're going to have income from that operation. Now, here's where I want to, if you're a cattle producer, you need to separate your haying operation from your cattle operation. Those are two different enterprises. One is selling hay to the cattle operation, and one is selling cattle wherever your outlet is for cattle, whether that's the sale barn or some type of a market. Anyway, so treat haying as its own entity and then calculate the cost from there, because you might get to the end of it and look at your costs of producing the hay and then realize to yourself, oh, hey, well, I mean, I could probably just buy hay and be money ahead. That happens a lot, right? So on your income side, you have the hay, usually in tons. And then if I were looking at this, if I were producing hay, even if you're retaining it within your own operation, put a dollar amount there. What hay is actually worth in your area and the quality of hay that you produce, and estimate your hay value that way. Okay. And then you have a bunch of operating costs like seed, fertilizer, crop protection like herbicides and whatnot, crop supplies, custom hired, like if you're going to hire someone to apply lime or something, your operator labor, your machinery fuel, your machinery repairs and maintenance, management, any other expenses that you might have, operating interest. Even if you're not taking out loans to do any of this, I think that it's important to put the interest in there on your operating costs, because that's kind of an opportunity cost of, you're putting that money out there and are you getting a return from that money? So oftentimes, especially, I guess, the bean counters here in the economists, they're going to want to see that operating interest, even if you're not actually taking out a loan. And then you have some other interesting things like farm business overhead, machinery ownership, real estate charge. So real estate, you're going to be looking at whatever the rent costs for like an acre of hay is in that area. Machinery ownership, look at all of your equipment. How much is that costing you per year? And really what you can do is you just put up the price, the value of your equipment today, and then guesstimate how many years into the future is this going to last you. And then divide the cost by the number of years, and then you'll get a cost per year, just about. Okay. So those are kind of the things that you're going to be looking at on a budget, when you're budgeting your haying operation. What I like to tell people to do is go out to your, walk around your farm and take a picture of anything that has to do with producing hay. Okay. And then go look at all those photos, inside, and your wife will start to say, I think you got a lot of crap out there. And that's probably happened already. You got a lot of junk that we haven't, moved down the road or whatever. But all of that ends up going into that machinery ownership cost, really. So when I'm giving presentations to farmers, I show an example of here at the research farm, and it's no different from, the farm I grew up on or any other, but I went around and I took a picture of everything that I could find on the farm that was used for making hay. And, what I found is I found a tractor hooked to every single implement, so we had a rake tractor, we have a swather tractor, we have a baling tractor. And then I found 4 balers. That's not uncommon too. I mean, we had 5 balers on the farm I grew up on growing up, and one of them didn't work. The other 3 worked, and one of them worked really well. Usually only used the one. We have a separate tractor for picking up the hay out of the field, and then about 3 different trailers for hauling the hay off of the field. Also have a silage wrapping, a wet wrap unit for round bales. Anyway, just a bunch of stuff. And to be honest, when there's really only 1 or 2 guys and you have a tractor for each, for your swather, for your rake, for your baler, and another one to pick it up, that's 4 tractors on a 1,000-acre farm to make a couple hundred acres of hay a year. And in all reality, you can only drive one of those tractors at a time. It's a whole lot cheaper to own less tractors and to spend the extra time to switch over implements than it is to have each separate tractor for its own job. So be critical about what you're doing and how you're doing it as far as your haying goes. And that way you can figure out what your real costs are. And honestly, what I've found, especially here in fescue country, if you're making fescue hay, you may be better off, especially if you have a smaller operation, you might just be better off to, sell all your haying equipment and buy hay. And then, all those hay acres, convert that to pasture, and away you go. Maybe you can run more cattle now that you have more pasture and you're buying your hay.
No, I appreciate you going into the deep dive and pulling up that budget and kind of going through. I don't know if you went through each line or just kind of hit the main things, but I was really glad that you also brought up labor, because from my perspective, I think that's the main thing a lot of farmers and ranchers or hay producers forget. Anyone in production agriculture, even any business owner, forgets to account for when we're looking at a cost. We don't account for our own labor. We just assume it's our business. That doesn't matter, but it does. Are horn flies stressing your cattle? Make fly control one and done with Alticid IGR XRB. Alticid IGR XRB delivers season-long hornfly control from a single application bolus, providing up to 195 days of relief, regardless of mineral consumption or location. It breaks the hornfly life cycle with no impact on beneficial insects, giving you flexible, consistent control. Learn more at cargillanimalnutrition.com/Alticid bolus, and that link will be in the description.
My dad is one of those that really wants to go back to haying with horses, and loose hay. I keep trying to, of course he's retired now, but I oftentimes would tell him, yeah, but all of that time, and his argument is, yeah, but time is free, but in reality, time is not free. Your time is worth something. And I think that it's important when you talk about time to remember that your time is most valuable doing the thing that makes you the most money, not just doing stuff to do stuff, right? And if you are a good cattle producer, you will make your most money producing cattle, not producing hay. When you're looking at all this, you need to remember that. Yeah, maybe you're not the best mechanic, and maybe you're not the best, that maybe that's just not a good expenditure of your time. And you would make more money if you focused on one of your more profitable enterprises.
What do you think gets most people when they find that producing hay is not profitable? Is it the time? Is it the fuel? Is it they're running newer equipment that they might even have loans on? Because that can be so individual. I know you were talking about, having basically a tractor for each piece of equipment, which I'm very familiar with, but we also think about it. We use those tractors on the farm as well for augers and whatnot. So those are getting split between several different enterprises, and we run older equipment, but we know some of our neighbors run newer equipment. So I'm just curious, where do most people find that the hay is not profitable? Is it in that equipment, the fuel, the time?
Usually it's tied in, the fuel's not a huge expense. The time's not a huge expense. Usually it ends up being the equipment cost. If you're really honest about your equipment and all of that, because if you're running older equipment and you're doing all the mechanic work yourself, you're supplementing your haying enterprise with your mechanic skills. I have a brother that's a mechanic, and he did this for a number of years. He was a custom hay operator, and eventually he realized that he could make more money fixing someone else's tractors than to fix his own tractors and turn it into hay. The equipment thing cuts a couple different ways. The first way is the rising costs of equipment. And equipment costs have gone up, and you'll know this if you've bought hydraulic fluid. You'll know this if you had to get new pickup teeth for your baler. Equipment costs have gone up. If you're going to go and buy a brand new baler today, it's going to cost you, and if you think in terms of calves, if you're a cow-calf producer, it's going to cost you roughly 28 calves to buy a brand new round baler. And you say, okay, well, that's not too bad. But compare that to 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it only took 14 calves to buy a brand new round baler. So the cost of purchasing the equipment in itself has, even for used equipment, has gone up exponentially. We're looking at about 10 times faster inflation rate than cattle prices. So if you're thinking about it that way, especially if you've been in the cattle business for a long time, to be honest, the times have changed just a little bit because the relationship of cattle prices to equipment has changed drastically. So that's the first thing. Hey, equipment costs have gone up. The second thing is what we talked about, over-equipped farms. And I hit on this earlier. An over-equipped farm has more equipment than what it needs to operate. And usually that's a lifestyle choice or a convenience choice more than a business choice, right? Or it's an ego choice, potentially. There might be something with your ego that you need the brand new green paint or whatever, right? But if you're treating it like a business, then you'll make sure that you're not keeping extra inventory or equipment inventory than what you need, essentially.
Is there more you want to touch on this business side before we dive into maybe some other options if once producers decide putting hay up is not right for their business?
Yeah, no, I think that should be sufficient. But like we talked about earlier, it's a really good idea to just to go in and put everything down on a paper and figure it out for yourself. I'm probably going to sit here and try to convince you that maybe making hay isn't the best use of your time and resources if you're a cattle operator. I think that you should do that homework for yourself. And another thing too is, with the over-equipped farms, if you are at a reasonable scale, then that becomes a non-issue, right? Let's say you're a producer that has maybe, 400 to 500 head of cattle. Okay, there's enough scale there where owning your own equipment and making your own hay might make sense because you're operating at a large enough scale that you can do that. But it's interesting that the average in Missouri producers here that makes hay makes around 75 acres of hay, which is not a whole lot. In Idaho, it was a little higher, but I think the national average runs right around 80 acres per operation, per haying operation. And that's really, really low. And it's even difficult, even with like really old equipment, to make that pencil in the long run. Yeah.
I didn't realize the national average was that low. That's
Super
crazy
low.
to me up here in North Dakota. I mean, we're putting up more than that, it seems.
And I'll bet you if you looked at the average of hay acres compared to the farms that make hay, you're probably running in there between, 150 and 80 acres per operation. So still small, really small.
Let's say producers do their homework and they say, wow, this haying enterprise, it's not working. We talked about you potentially grazing those acres as an alternative. What else should producers consider as an alternative to putting up their own hay? You talked about buying a little bit. What else can you share?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I think it's safe to say that even the best grazers in America are still feeding some hay. So I'm not here to say let's just rule hay out altogether. Let's just be strategic about our use of hay because hay is one of the most expensive pieces of our operation. If you look at a cow-calf operation in the budget, the largest line item on that budget is feed. And most of that feed cost is in the form of hay, whether you're producing it yourself or purchasing it from off the farm. So let's first talk about purchasing hay. I think that that's a very important use of your time. If you've realized that, maybe it's time to kick the hay habit and focus more on the livestock side of things, the first thing that I recommend is just sell all your haying equipment. And that does a couple of things for you. It frees up the capital and it forces you to not go back to that. You've already made the decision and you know that it's not working for you. Don't go back to it unless things change dramatically between like the relationship of cost of equipment to cattle or something like that. If that changed, then maybe it'd be worth going back to. So then the next piece is if you've made hay your whole life, it's kind of difficult to figure out the whole purchasing hay process. But I would say don't worry about that too much because it's very likely that you're going to find that you can purchase higher quality hay than what you are making. And you can control the quality of that hay completely. You can inspect the hay, you can sample hay and send it in for forage test analysis so that you know exactly what you have. If there's a year where 50% of the people got their hay rained on, you can go and find the producer who didn't get their hay rained on and purchase that hay, right? That's especially of value. If you think about going back to making hay, maybe you were the one that got your hay rained on and now you're stuck with this low quality forage. When you're purchasing hay, you have a ton of freedom in what you buy. The next piece of that is to form really good relationships with, people who are really good at making hay. And when I say relationships, I think the most important piece of a relationship with between a hay producer and a cattle producer is getting paid, right? Growing up on a hay operation, that was the number one thorn in our side when dealing with customers. And we had some dairy customers too that would buy hay. It was really hard to welcome a customer back that didn't pay us or that had a bad check. We loved the customers that, every time they would come and pick up their hay, that there was a check there. And when drought and things hit like that and there's a shortage of hay, guess who gets bumped to the front of the line? It's the people who paid on time and their checks are always good. It's funny just being in the business for, at least being in the hay business for quite a while, I've realized that it's crazy how many producers don't do that, for the people that they're purchasing from. And so that's one thing that I always recommend, because if you treat the person that you're purchasing hay from well, then they're going to treat you well when times get tough, or at least you hope they will. There's the purchasing the hay part. And then if you're new to this and you're getting away from making hay, give yourself a little buffer, buy a little more hay than what you expect to use, stuff like that, because that'll help you sleep well at night when the wind is howling in the middle of winter and you're not sure that you bought enough hay. I guess that pretty much covers the hay making stuff or the hay purchasing side of things. Now, let's move on to some other profitable alternatives. It might be, if you're a mixed operation, you have some row crops and some cattle, it might be of value to you to change from those, change those hay fields into corn fields or something like that. And you're still getting some use out of it with the cattle because you can graze corn stubble later in the year. You can convert it to pasture. That's something that I would highly recommend. If you're in the fescue belt, is if you have fescue hay fields, it's not too difficult to dig a small pond so that you have some water on the farm and turn and put a fence around it and turn that into a cow pasture. And from some of the research, because I do quite a bit of research on comparing hay versus grazing. And some of that research shows that you can make almost twice as much money per acre if you graze it than if you hay it. And so that's something to be aware of. And grazing responds better to management. You know, the nice thing about grazing is that if you have a high quality forage and it's raining for the next 7 days, you can still harvest because the cattle don't mind if it rains on their hay or rains on their forage, but your swather and your baler sure do mind, you know, that. So that's something of value as well. So you're capturing the forage at a better place in time than maybe you could if you're making hay out of it.
NovaGraze herbicide is a groundbreaking weed control solution that enables cattle producers to preserve white clover and control many broadleaf weeds at the same time. Only one product can make this claim. That's NovaGraze. So why is this important? When it comes to your operation, grass is your lowest cost feed source. For every pound of weeds you eliminate, you get back up to 1.5 pounds of grass. Learn more at rangeandpasture.com/cattle conversations, and that link is in the description. I appreciate you bringing up the examples that you just did, and to your point about the cattle don't care if it got rained on. That's kind of a situation we were in last year. It was really tough to put hay up. We were very grateful for all the moisture throughout the summer. I mean, it allowed us to graze quite a ways into the fall and winter because of it. But as far as haying goes, there was maybe one field that got put up without getting rained on once, if not twice. So it was a tough year for that last year for us.
Yeah, and that was seen all across the country. It was a huge pain point. You know, you can completely control the quality of the hay that you purchase. You can't always control the quality of the hay that you make. And that's definitely true. But when you're putting it through a cow instead, you can always harvest it at the right time, whether it's raining or shining, because it's just out there green and growing, which is great. So, yeah.
Is it standard practice for the person who is selling the hay to run those hay samples and provide that quality analysis prior to sale, or is it just dependent? I mean, I'm just thinking about that as, you know, say, for example, if my husband and I went to purchasing hay, you know, I would like to see that quality analysis beforehand.
Yeah, it depends on the situation, I guess. If you go to a hay auction, which they do have those, there's one in almost every corner of every state, at least somewhere. Usually it's hay buyers that are buying all the hay. But if you go to a hay auction, pretty much all of the hay at a hay auction has been forage tested, which is kind of nice. And then it just depends on the hay producer whether they supply a forage test or not. Growing up, we did not, because horse customers didn't really care what the quality of the hay was. They just want it to be green. That's all they cared about. They just want it to be green and leafy. And so that's what we did. But, you know, to be honest, $20 or $30 hay test is well worth it if you're going to go and buy, I don't know, however many tons of hay that you need, you know, 50, 100 tons. That's a pretty big purchase. And I think that it's worth a lot to you just to, you know, pull the hay test. It's worth, you know, it's $30, but it may inform you whether that hay is a good buy, or it may even help you negotiate a lower price or something like that. Or it may tell you, it may validate and say, okay, yeah, this hay is a good buy. Like you said, it's kind of daunting if you went away from making hay to purchasing hay. You know, you hear all of those scary stories about, you know, this junk and the weeds and all that kind of stuff. But
well, yeah, the weeds is the other question. And actually, prior to this episode coming out, I just recorded it last week, but there'll be a podcast coming out about weed control. And we talk about weed control in those grazing settings as well as in those haying settings as well. And yeah, that's really important to be aware of.
Yeah. My favorite hay to purchase is some from close by, one, because you don't have all of the freight. And oftentimes you can convince the producer to drop it right in your yard after it comes out of the field. They love that. You love that because you don't have to haul hay anywhere. And it also helps you, because you're riding by, maybe even every day you're watching and you're seeing what kind of hay they're putting up. And, if they know your standards, then they'll know if you want it or not. If it gets rained on 10 times like it did last year, then, they'll understand, yeah, that hay is not for me. I'll buy your other stuff. But that's my favorite place to get hay out of all of the places, because you kind of know when it's been cut. You're a very well informed buyer at that point, and it may be even worth a couple more dollars a bale to get that hay and to have a good close relationship with a good neighbor.
Absolutely. Carson, we have covered a lot of ground, from how to determine the cost of production, what to consider if you do decide to go away from making your own hay. As we wrap up our time here today, if there's one thing you want listeners to remember, what is that?
There's a couple of things that we haven't really covered, and maybe it's just another pile of podcasts that, need to happen. And there's people more experienced on all of this than I am. But you can make a lot of ground in off-season grazing. The easy one, if you're in crop country, is picking up corn stalks. That's one of the low-hanging fruit. Pretty much everywhere in the country, usually you're seeing, and they've done this research extensively in Nebraska, and the corn farmers know it. They're seeing, maybe a 5 or a 10 bushel bump in yield in their bean crop following their corn residue being grazed. So crop producers see the value of having animals on there after they've produced corn, and you can usually get those acres fairly cheap. If you compare the costs going from hay this year, feeding hay is going to cost you anywhere from $1.10 to $1.50 per head per day. Then if you go and look at stockpiled fescue, nitrogen fertilized stockpile fescue, you're going to be around that 65 cents per head per day, almost half to go from hay to stockpiled fescue. Corn stalks are going to be around that 50 cents per head per day mark. That's a pretty good value. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that you could get into with stockpile grazing, like grazing milo or grazing standing corn. And on our grazing, we graze a lot of milo here in Missouri. I mean, the people who are wild enough to do it, and everybody who tries it loves it. Well, almost everybody. On good grain yielding milo, we can get about 450 cow days per acre. And the cost per cow per day is around 45 cents. One of the cheapest ways of feeding cows through the winter that I've ever seen. That's the other piece to this whole hay versus stockpile grazing stuff, is that there are things you can do to feed hay for cheaper that may be well worth your time. Up there in North Dakota, I think I've heard of a few people that graze standing corn. I'm not sure how that works. It probably works pretty well, as from what I've heard. There's options, and really, honestly, if you put your mind to it, you can figure out a way to graze through the winter with minimal hay feeding, because hay feeding, whether you purchase it or make it, it's going to be the most expensive. It's going to be the most expensive feed you produce in the year. The cheapest feed you produce in the year, of course, is your spring flush. That's the cheapest forage. But hay is the most expensive. But there's other ways, you can do stockpile stuff that are lots cheaper, half the cost of producing the hay. So, along with that, I always have to mention calving date. A cow has its peak nutrient requirements, 2 weeks before it's calving, and the 2 months following calving, when it's at its peak milk production. That's when it needs the most energy. And energy comes in the form of digestible nutrients. It's not necessarily a crude protein issue at all. focus on the energy because that's what the cow is usually lacking in is energy. That's why cows lose weight. All of that kind of stuff is because they don't have enough energy in their forage. So the problem is that a lot of people back that calving date up, into the winter months, further than they ought to. And that puts a pinch on, that makes it difficult because here you are, the animal's at peak nutrient requirement. And here you are, in the middle of, winter, maybe it's March, but it's still kind of snowy. Even here in Missouri, March might be a little early. And you don't have that much good quality forage. Even if you're feeding hay, it's not as good as it ought to be. And so if you're feeding hay, you end up feeding a lot more hay if you calve early because that animal is eating more because it has a higher energy demand. You can cut down your hay costs quite a bit by moving that calving date into a position where you're feeding the animals when they're at their highest consumption levels on your cheapest possible forage to grow, which is in the springtime during the spring forage flush. It's also the highest quality forage that you have. And so I think that that's where a lot of people really struggle with the whole, moving away from making hay and moving away from feeding hay is because you can't see a reasonable way to feed a lactating animal on stockpile forage. And I 100% agree. If you're going to be calving in the middle of winter, you need to have a barn full of hay and a whole bunch of tree rows full of hay too, because you'll need it. If you line that up with when you have the most forage, the most cheapest forage, then everything will kind of line up.
I'm glad you brought those points up because they're ones that some of them have been brought up on the podcast before. Some of them are ones that I just hear a lot between different ranchers or at conventions, etc., especially moving that calving date back. So a lot of food for that there. And like you said, probably a few other podcasts just within that, what you just talked about.
Right. And, I don't want to bag too hard on weaning weights because when you look at profits, you're selling more animal and your gross sales go up. So the top line sales. But what is your net income of that? Is the cost of feeding all of that hay to a lactating animal in the winter worth the extra weaning weights? And the data would show, if you look at a number of studies that have been done, you will find a number of interesting things. One, weaning weights do not influence profitability of a cattle operation. It's kind of counterintuitive to what people say, but if you look at profitable producers across the country, the most profitable producers, you will find some with high weaning weights, maybe, but you're going to find a whole bunch of people who just have average, and maybe even below average weaning weights because they understand that that's not the thing that's the key driver. Another thing that you'll find is that a lot of producers that are making the most money, and this has been extensively studied as well, aren't at max capacity either. They're somewhere behind max capacity on their stocking rates. And when you do that, you're actually able to graze further into the fall or winter. You're able to graze further in the winter because you usually have more forage ahead of you, and you're not always pushing your cattle to eat every last blade of grass that there is. There's a lot of flexibility that comes with all of that. There's a million different ways you can take that, but just what I've seen.
That's a whole nother rabbit hole, Carson.
Exactly. Yeah. But it all goes back to how much hay are you feeding? That's where all the, that's the black hole where all the money went. When you get to the end of the year, where did all my money go? Well,
yep.
I'll tell you where it went.
All right. Well, folks, remember the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this information valuable. Because
a 5-star review.
Yes, 5 stars. Always 5 stars. If you're going to leave a comment, make it nice.
No, I'll take the mean comments too. So if you have any, don't send them to Shay, send them to me.
Yeah, and we will make sure that any information mentioned throughout the show is available in the description as well. But remember to leave that rating and review. And if you're a YouTube fan, I have been on YouTube for a few years now, so you can check out the full episodes there as well. But with that, happy ranching, folks.